In the depths of Louisville, Kentucky, there's a place where death didn't just visit, it moved in permanently. A sprawling 5-story structure sits like a tombstone against the skyline, abandoned, decaying, and absolutely teeming with paranormal activity. This is Waverly Hills Sanatorium, and today we're going to uncover the dark history that turned a hospital built to save lives into one of the most haunted locations on Earth. Tens of thousands of people died within these walls. Some say the number is closer to 68,000. Bodies were transported in secret through hidden tunnels. Nurses took their own lives. Patients underwent barbaric procedures that were just as deadly as the disease itself. And now, more than 60 years after it was abandoned, visitors and paranormal investigators continue to report encounters with the spirits trapped inside. So stick around as we dive deep into the chilling history of Waverly Hills, explore the paranormal activity that refuses to stop, and uncover the mystery of Room 502, the most haunted room in one of America's most haunted buildings. To understand why Waverly Hills became such a death trap, we need to travel back in time to the turn of the 20th century. At the beginning of the 1900s, America was facing a silent killer. It crept through cities like a phantom, claimed entire families, devastated towns, and left no survivors in its wake. The disease was called by many names: the White Plague, the White Death, consumption, but most people knew it by its scientific name, tuberculosis. And Louisville, Kentucky, it was ground zero. The Ohio River Valley had become the tuberculosis capital of America. By 1900, Louisville had the highest death rate from TB in the entire nation. People were dying by the thousands. Families would wake up to find a loved one coughing blood into their pillow. Within weeks, they'd be in their grave. The problem was that no one knew how to stop it. There was no cure, there was no vaccine, there was nothing but the terrifying reality that once you contracted tuberculosis, your chances of survival were grim. So what did doctors do? They had an idea, a revolutionary idea at the time. If fresh air and sunlight could cure the disease, then the solution was to build a hospital on a hill, surrounded by nature, where patients could breathe clean air and soak in healing sunlight. In 1906, Louisville formed the Board of Tuberculosis Hospital. By 1908, they had a plan. They needed to find the perfect location, somewhere elevated, remote, with scenic views, and isolation from the general population. They found it in a place called Waverly Hill. The property originally belonged to a man named Major Thomas H. Hayes. He'd built a house there and even constructed a one-room schoolhouse for his daughters. Their teacher was a woman named Lizzie Lee Harris, who happened to be a huge fan of Sir Walter Scott's Waverly novels. The property became known as Waverly Hill, though somewhere along the way, one of the E's got lost and it became Waverly. On July 26, 1910, the original Waverly Hills Sanatorium opened its doors. It was a modest 2-story wooden structure with 2 wings, one for men, one for women. It could hold 40 patients total. It cost just $25,000 to build. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. The facility was immediately overwhelmed. By 1912, patients from the old Louisville City Hospital were transferred to Waverly Hills. The overcrowding became so severe that tents were erected on the grounds. Patients were literally sleeping outside. In 1915, a children's pavilion was added with 50 beds, both for sick children and for the children of patients, separated from their parents, forced to watch their moms and dads slowly fade away. By the 1920s, it was clear that the original building couldn't contain the flood of dying patients, so they decided to build something bigger, something that would become iconic and infamous. In 1924, construction began on a massive new facility. Designed by architect D.X. Murphy, the new Waverly Hills Sanatorium would be a 5-story structure spanning 180,000 square feet. It was revolutionary for its time. Every patient would have their own room, a telephone, a radio, and their own solarium porch where they could be exposed to healing sunlight. It opened on October 17, 1926. It was supposed to be a palace of healing. Instead, it became a palace of death. Once the new building opened, Waverly Hills Sanatorium grew into something more than just a hospital. It became a self-contained world. The facility had its own zip code, its own post office, its own laundry facilities, its own butcher shop, water treatment systems, and acres of farmland. It was completely isolated from the outside world, intentionally designed to prevent the spread of infection. This meant that doctors and nurses didn't just work there, they lived there, full-time. They couldn't leave. Their entire lives were spent inside these walls, surrounded by death and disease. The treatments. Now remember, in the 1920s and 1930s, tuberculosis was still a mystery. There was no cure, so doctors became desperate, and desperation led to experimentation. Some of their treatments were barbaric by today's standards. The basic approach was simple enough: fresh air, sunlight, nutritious food, and complete rest. They built sunrooms where patients were exposed to artificial ultraviolet light. In the winter, they'd place patients in chairs on the roof or open porches, covered in blankets and snow, believing that the cold air and sunlight would somehow miraculously cure them. Old photographs from the era show patients bundled up like they're about to head to the Arctic, frozen stiff, while doctors insisted this was exactly what they needed. But when fresh air and sunlight didn't work, and it usually didn't, doctors turned to more extreme measures: the dark procedures. Some patients underwent a procedure called artificial pneumothorax. They'd surgically insert a balloon into their lungs and inflate it. The goal was to collapse the infected lungs so it could rest. In theory, this made sense. In practice, it killed a lot of people. Others underwent a lobectomy. Surgeons would cut out the infected portion of the lung. The death rate from this procedure alone was staggering. But the worst, the absolute worst, was called thoracoplasty. This procedure involved removing 7 to 8 of a patient's ribs. The idea was that removing the rib cage would allow the remaining lung to expand more fully and take in more oxygen. Imagine that, having your ribs literally ripped out of your body while you're conscious. Some patients survived it, most didn't. And of the ones who did, the psychological trauma was almost as deadly as the disease itself. Slow, deliberate tone. There was also electroshock therapy. For patients whose tuberculosis had spread to their brains, doctors would strap them down and send thousands of volts of electricity through their bodies, believing this would somehow help their minds cope with the disease. It didn't work. It just caused more suffering. In one patient's diary from 1935, a diary that was discovered decades later in the ruins of the building, a woman described the procedure this way: "The pain was like being struck by lightning over and over. They kept saying it would help. All I felt was my body convulsing, my teeth breaking, my mind screaming." And then there was the matter of all the bodies. Death was a near daily occurrence at Waverly Hills. Every single day, patients were dying. Some from tuberculosis, some from the treatments themselves. The constant cloud of death created unbearable morale problems. Patients would see corpses being wheeled past them. Dying patients would watch other dying patients get wheeled away, never to be seen again. So the hospital administration made a decision. They would hide the dead. In secret, they constructed an underground tunnel, a motorized rail and cable system that ran from the hospital down to the railroad tracks at the bottom of the hill. This tunnel became known as the body chute. Under the cover of darkness, bodies were loaded into the tunnel and quietly transported down to waiting trains. The bodies would be shipped out to who knows where. The goal was psychological. If patients couldn't see how many people were dying, maybe they wouldn't lose hope. It was a lie built into the very architecture of the building. As for the death toll, the numbers are heavily disputed. Some urban legends claim that as many as 68,000 people died at Waverly Hills. The official hospital records, however, tell a different story. According to Dr. J. Frank Stewart, a former assistant medical director at the hospital, the highest number of deaths in a single year was 152. By 1955, that had dropped to 42. Based on death certificates, it's estimated that approximately 6,000 to 8,000 people died within these walls over the course of the facility's operation. But here's the thing. Even 6,000 deaths is an almost incomprehensible number. That's 6,000 people's last moments spent inside a building that reeked of death and despair. 6,000 souls trapped between life and death, suffering unimaginable pain. Is it any wonder that so many of them never left? If Waverly Hills has a heart of darkness, room 502 is that heart. On the 5th floor of the hospital, there was a section that was different from the rest. It consisted of 2 nurses' stations, a pantry, a linen room, a medicine room, and 2 medium-sized patient rooms on either side of the nurses' stations. The rooms were unusual because they were glassed in on all sides and opened out onto an open patio-type roof. Patients there were free to move about. They weren't confined or isolated more than anyone else. They were just ordinary tuberculosis patients. But Room 502 became legendary. The nurse's suicide, 1928. According to the stories that have been passed down through decades, in 1928, a nurse was found dead in Room 502. She had hanged herself from the light fixture. Her name has been lost to time, but the details remain eerily consistent in the legends. She was 29 years old, unmarried, and pregnant. The father of her child wasn't mentioned. Perhaps he'd abandoned her. Perhaps he was married to someone else. The specifics don't matter anymore. What matters is that a young woman, facing impossible circumstances, decided that the only way out was death. She walked into Room 502, found a light fixture or a pipe, the stories vary, and ended her life. It's unclear how long her body hung there before someone discovered her, but when they did, the rumor spread through the hospital like wildfire. A nurse, dead by suicide, inside the hospital itself. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The second death, 1932. But that wasn't the only tragedy. In 1932, just 4 years later, another nurse working on the same floor allegedly jumped from the roof patio outside Room 502. She plunged several stories to her death. Some say she jumped. Others whisper that she was pushed. There are rumors that she knew something, that she'd witnessed something terrible happening on the 5th floor and was silenced. But there's no evidence, just whispers, just speculation. Just a lingering question. Did she really jump, or was she murdered? The truth gets murky, though. Here's where it gets interesting. When paranormal investigators and historians tried to verify these stories, they ran into problems. There are no official death records documenting either of these incidents. No death certificates, no newspaper reports, nothing in the hospital archives. Some people claim that a former staff member named John Thornberry verified these stories before he died in 2006. But here's the problem. According to his obituary, Thornberry was born in 1922. That would have made him 6 years old in 1928 and 10 years old in 1932. So how could a child verify deaths that he supposedly witnessed? The other inconsistency, the suicide method. According to the legend, the nurse hanged herself from the light fixture. But the light fixture in Room 502 is hung on a delicate decorative chain that couldn't possibly hold the weight of a person. Some versions of the story say she hung from a pipe over the door, but that pipe is actually part of the sprinkler system, and it was installed in 1972, decades after the alleged suicide. So was any of this real? The truth is, we don't know. There's no documentation, there's no hard evidence. But something happened in Room 502 that captured people's imagination so completely that the legend spread like a virus. Visitors to the hospital became obsessed with the room. Ghost hunters made it the centerpiece of their investigations. Paranormal investigators reported experiencing the most intense supernatural activity there. Maybe the legend is completely fabricated. Maybe it's loosely based on real events that have been buried under decades of speculation and rumor. Or maybe, just maybe, the spirits themselves have been preserving the memory of these tragic events and printing them into the very walls of the building. Whatever the truth is, Room 502 became the epicenter of the haunting, and it remains the most controversial and most investigated room in Waverly Hills to this day. The story of Waverly Hills might have remained one of tragedy and death, but then something unexpected happened. In 1943, an antibiotic called streptomycin was developed. For the first time in history, tuberculosis could be treated. It could be cured. The White Death, which had terrorized humanity for centuries, suddenly had an enemy. By 1949, Waverly Hills was administering streptomycin to its patients. The transformation was remarkable. The patient population began to decline. By the 1950s, TB cases were dropping. The constant stream of dying patients slowed to a trickle. And finally, in 1961, the remaining patients at Waverly Hills were transferred to another facility. For the first time in 51 years, Waverly Hills fell silent. But the silence didn't last long. In 1962, just 1 year after closing, Waverly Hills reopened as Woodhaven Geriatric Sanatorium, a nursing home for elderly patients. This is where the story takes another dark turn. There were reports of patient mistreatment, stories of unusual experiments. The facility became known for its horrific conditions. Budget cuts in the 1960s and 1970s led to neglect and abuse. Electroshock therapy, which had been used to torture TB patients, was now used on elderly residents. The building that had been a hospital of death became an old age home of suffering. In 1982, the state finally shut it down for good. By that point, Waverly Hills had seen enough death and suffering for 10 lifetimes. For nearly 2 decades after it closed in 1982, Waverly Hills sat abandoned. The building crumbled, windows broke, walls crumbled. Nature began to reclaim the structure. Graffiti covered the hallways. The entire building became a tomb. During this time, Waverly Hills became a magnet for urban explorers, thrill seekers, and homeless people looking for shelter. Teenagers would break in, daring each other to venture deeper into the dark corridors. And that's when the reports started. People began to talk about seeing things. A little girl in a white dress running up and down the 3rd floor solarium, her footsteps echoing, but her body leaving no footprints. A little boy with a leather ball, bouncing it endlessly in empty corridors. The silhouette of a hearse in the back of the building, its doors opening, delivering spectral coffins that would vanish when you got close enough to touch them. There were reports of a woman with bleeding wrists crying out for help from the windows, a man in a white coat walking through the kitchen, and the unmistakable smell of fresh baked bread wafting through rooms that hadn't seen a living soul in decades. Doors would slam shut of their own accord. Lights would flicker in windows where there was no electricity. Strange sounds echoed through empty hallways. Voices, footsteps, the scrape of something heavy being dragged across the floor. Then, in 2001, something changed. Charles and Tina Mattingly purchased the property with the intention of restoring it. They wanted to preserve it, to honor the history that had occurred within its walls. They began bringing in volunteers to clean up the building, to stabilize the structure, to prevent it from completely collapsing. And that's when the paranormal activity intensified dramatically. Volunteers reported objects being thrown at them by unseen hands. They felt sudden, unexplained cold spots. They heard disembodied voices calling out their names. Some volunteers claimed to be actually struck by invisible entities. Doors would slam shut so hard that the volunteers would flee the building in terror. Others reported seeing full-bodied apparitions standing in doorways and corridors, only to vanish when approached. A woman named Sarah described her experience in 2003. "I was working on the third floor, trying to clean up rubble and debris. I felt a child's hand grab my ankle. I looked down and saw a small, translucent figure, a girl maybe 6 or 7 years old. She was staring at me with these hollow, sad eyes. I ran. I didn't stop running until I was outside the building, and I never went back." But all of this paranormal activity seemed to pale in comparison to what was happening in room 502. Paranormal investigators who entered room 502 reported the most intense supernatural experiences of their careers. People experienced sudden, overwhelming feelings of despair and sadness, so intense that grown men broke down in tears. Others reported hearing a woman's voice, weeping, begging for forgiveness. One investigator, Robert Chen, described his experience. "The moment I stepped into room 502, it was like someone had turned off all the light in the world. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't think. All I could feel was this crushing weight of depression and hopelessness. I understood in that moment why someone might choose to end their own life. The pain was that real." Today, Waverly Hills Sanatorium is open to the public. Tours are available year-round. Paranormal investigation groups come from all over the world to experience the haunting firsthand. Much of the building remains untouched since it closed in the early 1980s. Paint peels off doors like diseased skin. Debris litters the hallways. Graffiti covers the walls. Medical equipment sits in rooms where it was abandoned decades ago. It's like the building has been frozen in time, a time capsule of death and suffering. But the spirits refuse to be forgotten. Visitors continue to report encounters. The little boy with the leather ball still plays in the hallways. The woman with the bleeding wrists still cries from the windows. The man in the white coat still walks through the kitchen. And in room 502, people continue to experience the overwhelming despair that suggests the spirits of the 2 nurses who died there are still trapped, still suffering, still reaching out. One tour guide named Marcus shared this observation. "After 5 years of leading tours here, I stopped trying to rationalize what happens. I've learned to accept that this building is genuinely haunted. The spirits are here. They're real, and they're not going anywhere." Waverly Hills Sanatorium stands today as a monument to human suffering and an unexplained phenomenon that defies rational explanation. We know that approximately 6,000 to 8,000 people died within these walls. We know that countless others underwent barbaric treatments in desperate attempts to cure an incurable disease. We know that at least 2 people took their own lives here. We know that after the hospital closed, the building was used as a site of elder abuse and neglect. But what we don't know, what remains a mystery, is why the spirits of Waverly Hills refuse to leave. Why do they remain trapped in these corridors, these rooms, these walls? Are they bound by unfinished business? Are they held here by the sheer weight of the suffering that occurred? Or is there something else, something we can't explain, that keeps them anchored to this place? The answers, it seems, remain buried in the darkness of room 502. If you've experienced something paranormal, if you visited Waverly Hills and encountered something inexplicable, drop your story in the comments below. And if you're brave enough to visit Waverly Hills yourself, do it during the day on a public tour first. Trust me on this. Thanks for joining me on another journey into the unknown. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. And remember, the dead may rest, but their stories live forever.